Hello everybody, nice to be here again, and I've been looking forward to telling you the second part of the story that I started last week about Simon and Lester. So we're going to get straight into it. Now, as you remember from last week, Lester had had an accident and he'd been taken off the boat, and Simon had been left down in the engine room, and that's where we're going to continue the story from. Simon was now 5 years old and he was growing up very quickly, even though he was still very small for his age. He'd still never been out of the engine room. He hadn't set 1 foot out of the engine room. He'd lived his whole life there with the workers that fueled the huge oven that drove the big propellers round to make the boat move forward. And Simon's life was really going back and forward between New York and London. And the workers really looked after him. He always had enough to eat. There were some very clever people working down there, so he always had toys and things to play with. But he really missed Lester. And he would spend a lot of time on his bunk bed. He had the top bunk and Lester slept underneath. He would spend a lot of time on his top bunk, just playing with his toys, and sometimes just lying down and looking up at the ceiling and thinking. Now, one day, that's exactly what Simon was doing. To be honest, he was a little bit bored. Everybody seemed to be busy, and he was alone in the bedroom, in the bunk room, we call it, because it was full of bunk beds. And there he was, lying down on the top bunk, just looking up at the ceiling, not doing very much at all, when he noticed a small door that was just below the ceiling, kind of where the wall met the ceiling. And he couldn't imagine how he'd never noticed it before. It wasn't very clearly marked because the wall was painted white and the door was white too, but he could clearly see a small line around the outside where the door opened up and a tiny small handle. And he wondered what it was. He found that if he stood on his bed and reached up, he could reach the handle, and he pulled it and the door opened. And it was a very, very small opening, just big enough, Simon thought, for him to crawl through. And the first time he found the door, he didn't do anything at all. He just opened it up and he stuck his head inside. And when he stuck his head inside and looked up, there was a ladder, and the ladder, a big steel ladder, went all the way up. He couldn't see the end of the ladder, and he had no idea what it was used for, what the ladder was used for. It looked like a big round pipe that the ladder was inside, but he didn't know where it went to. And he shut the door and lay back down on his bed and thought to himself, well, perhaps next time I'll climb inside, see if I can climb inside and get to the top of the ladder. And he was quite excited because he, like I said, he'd never been out of the engine room and he'd been quite bored in the last couple of months. And he thought to himself, well, the next time I'm alone in the bunk room and there's no one else around, I'll go inside and climb up the ladder and see what's at the top. So he had to wait for quite a few days because the bunk room always seemed to be busy with people sleeping or people talking or people just lying down and resting on their beds. So it was at least a week that had gone by before Simon found himself alone in the bunk room again. And when he did, he didn't waste too much time. He opened up the little door, he stood on his tiptoes, and he managed to push himself up onto the ledge of the door and crawl inside. He grabbed hold of the ladder and he started climbing. And he climbed and he climbed and he climbed. And eventually he got to the top of the ladder. And when he did, there was another round pipe that led off somewhere into the ship. And Simon started crawling along it. And he crawled and he crawled and he crawled, and he seemed to be passing little vents, air vents in the bottom of the pipe that he could look down and look down into the ship. And he would stop every time he got to one of these air vents, and he would look down to see which part of the ship he was in. And it was super interesting for him, of course, because he'd never seen the rest of the ship. Now, when he got to the end of that pipe, something very strange happened, because the pipe stopped, but it split into lots of different directions. I didn't say in the story how many directions, but at least 20. And Simon got a bit worried, because he thought, well, if I crawl down one of these pipes and it splits again, what happens if I start getting lost? So he thought he'd done enough for that first trip. And like I say, the last thing he wanted to do was start crawling down one of these pipes and find that split in different directions too, and suddenly he couldn't find his way back. So he got a little bit frightened, and he turned around and he crawled back again to the ladder, and he came back down the ladder, and he came out of the little door which he'd actually shut just in case anybody had come in, and he opened up the door, had a look around, made sure there's no one back in the bunk room, and he climbed back down on his bed. And for the next 2 or 3 days he thought about how he could explore. And it was when he was playing with his chalk and drawing on one of the floors outside of the bunk room that he had an idea. His chalk was really crumbly, and he had at least 20 colours. And he found that if he broke a piece of chalk and crumbled it in his hand, he had coloured chalk dust. Now, if he had 20 colours, all he would need to do was get some string, and there was string everywhere because it was used a lot down in the engine room. If he could get 20 lengths of string and dip them in the chalk dust, the string would become the colour of the chalk dust, and he would have 20 pieces of string that were different colours. When he was exploring each one of these pipes, all he would have to do was unravel the string behind him, the coloured string, and then he could find his way back. And then he could leave the string in the pipe, and he would know that he'd already explored that pipe, and then he could pick another colour and explore the second pipe, and then leave that string along the pipe, and then the third and the fourth and the fifth, every time leaving a different coloured piece of string, so that he knew that he'd explored that particular pipe. It was a great idea, and that's exactly what he did. So excitedly he started off with red, and he crumbled up one of his red chalks, and he took some string and cut it into 20 different lengths, and he dipped the first ball of string into the chalk, and he took it with him up the ladder. And the first pipe he explored was pretty boring. It didn't seem to go anywhere, and sure enough it did split. So when the pipe split and Simon went off and explored in that first direction, he made sure he unravelled the red string behind him so he would know the way back. And when he came back, of course, to the ladder, he left the string there and tied it to the end so that he knew that he'd been down that pipe. And he spent the next 2 or 3 weeks exploring all of the different pipes that went into all of these different directions in the boat. And he was probably on his 5th or 6th colour when he got a bit of a shock, because he was crawling down one of the pipes when there was a big blast and a loud noise, and Simon lay down flat because he thought, is there something coming? When a huge gust of air was pushed down the pipe, and it was then that Simon really understood what the pipes were for, because they were for the air conditioning, and all of the cold air was coming down the pipes, and of course it was going down the little grates at the bottom of the pipe so that the boat, the ship, was kept lovely and cool for all of the rich passengers on the boat. Now of course it didn't happen all the time. After a while it shut off, and then it was nice and quiet again. But every once in a while Simon had to get used to this big blast of cold air coming past him as it disappeared down into the grates over to all the different parts of the ship. Now, after about 2 weeks, Simon had explored nearly all of the different pipes, and he'd been to lots of different parts of the ship. He'd been right up to the top where the captain steered the boat. He'd been down to the sun deck and the swimming pool. He'd been to some of the cabins and looked down into the cabins where the people slept at night, and he had 2 pipes left to explore. And luckily enough, he had 2 colours. He had pink and he had green. And at first he couldn't decide which colour to use, but green was his favourite colour. That's actually why I'm wearing a green t-shirt today. So he took green, and the next time the bunk room was empty, he climbed up to the top of the ladder and he got ready to explore the tunnel, the 2 tunnels that was left. He couldn't decide which one, so he just picked one. And he attached the green piece of chalk to the end of the tunnel, and he started crawling along it and unravelling the green chalk behind him. And it was quite a long tunnel. And after a while, he started hearing music. And sound travelled really well in the pipes, of course, because there were these big grates, like I explained before, where the cold air was going down into for all of the passengers. So whatever sound was being made, people talking, people walking down the corridors and the hallways, the sound would often travel up into the pipe. And sometimes Simon would stop and listen to people talking. But this time it wasn't people talking, it was music. And Simon crawled a little bit quicker and a little bit quicker, and the music got louder and louder. Simon had not had much experience of listening to music. Some of the workers often sang songs down in the engine room, and they knew lots of songs, and Simon knew lots of songs too because he'd learned them. But he actually hadn't listened to any instruments playing. And so he didn't really know the name of the instrument when eventually he got right onto one of the grates and looked down on top of a piano. Now, like I said, Simon didn't even know the name of the instrument. He didn't know he was looking down on a piano. But what he'd actually done was he had crawled along the pipe that led to the banquet hall. And as I don't know whether you're going to remember, but in the beginning of the story when I told you that Lester was stealing things from the banquet hall, that's where Lester was found, on top of the piano. Lester was looking down onto that very same piano where he'd been found. And there was a musician playing there, and he was playing the piano. And Simon looked right down on top of his head, and he could watch the musician's fingers moving across the keys of the piano. And Simon was captivated. That means that he couldn't stop watching. He was absolutely fascinated with this beautiful music that was being played. And it wasn't long when he turned his head and kind of looked at the side of the grate that he could see people sitting on tables listening to this music, and some of them were getting up to dance. And when the musician had finished one piece of music, he started playing a second and a third, and Simon stayed there and he listened and he listened, and it wasn't long before he found his fingers on his knees playing the piano on his knees. What he didn't realize was that his fingers were actually copying exactly what he was seeing the musician playing. Now, I'll explain this a little bit further on in the story, but all you need to know at the moment was that Simon's fingers were moving on the same keys that the musician was hitting when he was playing the music. Simon didn't realise this at the time. All he was interested in was listening to this beautiful music being played. Now, Simon had a watch. He'd been given it a watch for his 3rd birthday, and he realised how long he'd been there, and he quickly crawled back, following his piece of string until he got to the end, and he came down the ladder. He checked that the bunk room was empty, and he dropped back down on his bed, and he lay down with his head on the piano with a huge smile on his face. thinking of this beautiful music that he'd discovered and wondering when he'd next have a chance to go back. Now Simon had kind of forgotten about the last tunnel. He still had his pink piece of string left, his last colour, but he was so interested in the music that he would go back there whenever he could. And he would go to the same spot. He would look down on top of the musician playing the piano, and sometimes the musician would play the same music, but often he would play different music, and Simon's fingers danced on his knees as he looked down and he watched the musician playing. Now he'd been doing this now for at least 2 or 3 weeks. The musician played every night for the people to dance to. As he came to the tunnel and was ready to go down it, he looked at the last tunnel and he decided that perhaps he should explore it the following evening. So the following evening he took his last colour with him, the pink piece of string covered in chalk, and he took it up to the ladder. He tied it off at the end of the tunnel and he crawled down to the end of the tunnel. And the tunnel was a very short one. And very unusually, the tunnel just ended. There was nothing there. It didn't split at all. There was just the end of the tunnel and that was it. And Simon thought to himself, pretty boring. I shouldn't have even bothered. And he was just about to turn around on his hands and knees and crawl back when he noticed a small door in the pipe. And he gave it a push and the door opened. And this was the first time that Simon had seen a door in a pipe. And he was nervous because, of course, he didn't want to stick his head through the door and find out that he was looking down on in somebody's cabin, or even worse, an officer was looking up at the door and had seen him. So he was a little bit nervous when he stuck his head through and looked into the room. And something quite strange was happening, because when he looked at the room carefully, it had no door. It was just 4 walls. And sitting in the middle of the room was a piano, an old piano, which was very dusty, but it was definitely a piano. Now again, like I said before, Simon didn't know the name of the instrument, but he recognised exactly what it was. And for the first little bit, he just looked at the piano and he looked at the room, because it was extremely strange. How did this huge piano get into a room that didn't have a door? The room definitely wasn't used, because you couldn't come in and out. The only way into the room was through the pipe, and nobody was crawling down the pipes. So he had no idea how this piano had got in there. The only thing he could think of was the piano was there and the room was built around the piano and just left there for some reason. Maybe it was an older piano that had never been used. Simon didn't know the answer. What he did know was that he wanted to go down to the piano. Coming through the pipe was a little bit dangerous because the pipes were close to the ceiling and Simon was a small little boy, but he found if he came through the pipe and hung on his fingertips, he could drop down onto the top of the piano, and from there he could get down to the floor. And he sat down on the chair and he pulled the chair in closer to the piano. The door he left open at the top because he wanted, obviously, he was worried about the door shutting and not being able to get back. And Simon put his fingers on the keys of the piano. And without thinking about it, he started playing. Simon had never played an instrument before. He didn't even know it was a piano. But, well, it was one of the things of this story that was amazing. Simon had learned every single song that he'd seen just by practicing on his legs, on his knees. He knew all of the keys. What Simon didn't know was that he had an amazing memory, and his fingers had remembered the position of every single note for every single song that he'd seen. And he started playing the piano. And the music he was playing was exactly the same as the music that he'd heard. But because his fingers were very young and quick, the music was even more beautiful, because in a way it was faster and happier and more jolly. So when Simon was playing all of these different songs, he would finish one and start another one. The music was travelling up into the pipe because he'd left the door open. Now Simon didn't realise this, he had no idea. But what was actually happening was this music was travelling all over the ship. So people walking around, walking down the hallways and the corridors, people in their cabins relaxing, the officers doing their jobs around the ship, they were listening to this beautiful piano music. And it wasn't long before some of the people started talking to the officers. What a great idea, they were saying, playing music during the day, and such amazing music. Who's playing? Now, the officers didn't know the answer. So the captain called the pianist. A pianist is somebody who plays the piano. And the pianist, this musician, came to the captain, and he was quite worried. The music was still playing when he was standing in front of the captain, and the captain said to him, "This doesn't make any sense. You're the only person who can play the piano, but you're standing in front of me. Who's playing your piano?" So they walked to the banquet hall thinking that somebody was playing it. One of the passengers, maybe one of the officers who hadn't told anybody he was very talented at playing the piano. But when they got to the piano, there was no one there. It was a mystery. The captain went back to his cabin and he called his first officer. First officer is the second person in charge of the ship. And he said to him, I'm going to give you a mission. Your mission, a mission is something you need to do, is to find out where this music is coming from. And the first officer started investigating. He went to every different part of the ship looking for a second piano, but of course he couldn't find one because nobody knew about the hidden room. But the first officer was quite a clever guy. I don't know his name, but he realised that the music seemed to be louder up towards the ceilings, and the music seemed to be coming from the air conditioning, the pipes. So it wasn't long before he'd taken off one of the grills and he'd stuck his head up inside the pipe and he started looking along it. And sure enough, the music was almost echoing down the pipes. But then suddenly it stopped. The reason why it stopped, of course, it was because Simon had stopped playing. And he'd climbed back on the piano, he pulled himself back into the pipe, he shut the door, and he'd climbed back to the ladder. But Simon loved playing so much that he kept on visiting the piano again. And he couldn't do it every day because sometimes, like I said, the bunk room was full of people, or he would go and listen to more music. But every second or third day he would visit the room. And every time he visited, of course, the music would start again. And the first officer realised he needed to follow the music. So after about the second or third time the music had been played, the officer had taken off his jacket and he'd crawled up inside the pipe and he was waiting. And sure enough, as the music started, he started crawling as quickly as he could towards the sound. Now, unlike Simon, he didn't have any coloured string with him, but he just started crawling towards the sound of the music. And he got closer and closer to the pipe where Simon had found, and he was down playing the instrument. Just as he got to that pipe, the music stopped and the officer stopped crawling. He was in a really good position to hide between two pipes, and he watched how this little boy pulled himself up and came out of the door of one of the pipes, the one that he was just about to crawl down. And so he disappeared into a dark area of the pipe that he was in, and he watched to see what would happen. And he watched how the little boy crawled all the way down, right past him actually, to the ladder at the end and climbed down the ladder. And the officer knew that the ladder led to the engine room. So now he had his answer. When the little boy had gone, he actually did crawl down to the end of the pipe, and he found the door and opened it up and realised, of course, that there was a second piano hidden in a room that had no door, and not even he could explain that. But he had his answer. And when he came back down from the pipe again, he, without talking to the captain, he went to the engine room and he knocked on the door. And I said to you in the first part of the story that officers don't go into the engine room because of their beautiful white uniform. So everybody was super surprised when the first officer walked into the engine room. And everybody stepped back because they knew that something was wrong. Officers didn't walk into the engine room, they stayed at the door. And the officer explained what had been happening. And immediately the workers guessed that it must have been Simon. He was the only one that could have crawled into the pipes. But they didn't want the officer to know that Simon was down there because they weren't supposed to have a child. So as soon as the door had opened, Simon had gone into the bunk room and he was on his top bunk. And the workers had always said to him, if anybody ever comes in here, you need to hide quickly. So Simon wasn't around, and all of the workers said, we know nothing about this. And the officer looked at them and said, listen, I know you have a small boy down here because I saw him come down the ladder and I saw what happened. You're not in any trouble, but you need to show me where the boy is hiding. And then one of the workers realised that this wasn't going to work. He'd kind of taken over from Lester in a way. He was kind of in charge of what happened in the engine room, and he shook his head. And he called for Simon to come out of the bunk room. And Simon, who'd actually been listening at the door, came down with his head down, came out of the room with his head down and walked up and stood next to his friends. And the officer looked at this little boy and he couldn't believe it. This boy, he thought first of all, this boy must be at least 13 or 14. But the boy he was looking at was 5-6 years old. Actually, Simon was, like I said, 5 years old. And he was tiny. How could somebody like that play the piano so beautifully? And the first thing he said to the little boy was, where did you learn to play the piano? And Simon said, what's a piano? And some of the workers started laughing. And they explained how Simon had never been out of the engine room. He didn't know what a piano was. And the officer could hardly believe it. So he asked Simon to come up to the captain's cabin, and Simon was super nervous. So the workers got Simon ready. He only had 2 sets of clothes, and his clothes were always covered in coal dust, of course, even his face. So they cleaned him and they put him in his smartest clothes, and of course they had to stay where they were, otherwise the boat would stop, of course. And the first officer, who was a very kind man, took Simon up to the captain's room, and there stood Simon in front of the captain, and he was shaking with fright. And the captain looked at him and he said, this is impossible. How could this boy be playing this music? He's better than the musician we have on the boat. It can't be true. And you're telling me he doesn't even know what a piano is? There must be an explanation. But there's a way to find out. Why don't we tomorrow night take him to the piano in the banquet hall and he can play for the people? So the following evening, everybody had heard about this, of course. So the banquet room was packed full of people, all waiting to hear this child, this 5-year-old, play music for them. So when Simon showed up and he sat down at the piano and he looked up at everybody staring at him, waiting for him to play, he completely froze, put his fingers on the keys, waiting to play, and he couldn't do a thing. And the captain looked over and thought to himself, I thought this was going to happen. This can't be true. But the first officer, who, like I said, was a very kind person, came up and he put his hand, on the edge of Simon's shoulder and whispered to him, "It will be all right. Just forget that there's nobody watching and just play." And Simon did. He started off very quietly, and then he got more confident, and he got more confident, and he played and he played. And when he played one song, he played a second and a third. And when he finished, the whole banquet hall erupted with applause. People stood up and clapped him. People wanted to come over and congratulate him. There were some people saying to him, "I'll give you £1,000 to come and play for me. I have a huge big music hall. The world is open to you." All Simon wanted to do was go back to his friends in the engine room. He wasn't interested in earning lots of money. He didn't even really know what money was for. But of course, when he went back down to the engine room, he didn't stay there long after that until the captain wanted to see him again. And the captain offered Simon a job. It so happened that the pianist, the musician, had to leave the boat, and to be honest, he was a little bit jealous of this superboy who could play music better than he could, and I think he probably would have left anywhere. But it was decided that Simon could stay on the ship, and that was his biggest worry, that he'd be told to leave. He could stay on the ship as long as he played music every evening. And that's what happened. Simon moved up into one of the cabins, one of the passenger cabins, and every night he would play for the people, and he became very, very famous. And everybody wanted to get on this ship because they wanted to hear the amazing Simon playing. And he stayed on the ship, and the ship carried on going from New York back to London, and time went on. And Simon stayed on the ship. He never got off the ship, not even when the ship landed in New York and everybody else got off the ship. He would stay with his friends down in the engine room, sharing stories and telling them what he'd seen on the boat, of course, because he was allowed to visit wherever he liked. And that's really the end of the story, because for the rest of Simon's life, even as an old man, he played beautiful music for the people on the ship. Now, I have one little treat for you before I finish this story, because in my story box there was one of the first records that was ever made, and this was made when Simon was a little boy. He would have been maybe 6 or 7, and somebody recorded him playing the music on the boat, and the record was in, well, it wasn't actually in the box, but it was underneath the box that I found in the tape gallery. And I had to find a record player, because record players are quite hard to come by. And I played the record, and I was amazed when I heard it. And that, like I say, Simon would have been, this was very soon after he played for the first time, when he played that first time for the captain and the people on the boat. So what I actually did was, to make it easier to travel around, I moved the music from the record onto my iPod, and I had the music on my iPod, and I often listen to it, for instance, when I'm driving to Houston in my car in the morning, because it always makes me smile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say goodbye to you all now, and I'm going to play you a little bit of music that Simon played very soon after he first played that piano. So I really enjoyed telling you that story. That's one of my favourites, actually, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. So stay safe, and I will see you next time. Bye.